Welcome to St. Jerome's University. Welcome to the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience. My name is David Seljak. I'm an associate professor of religious studies here at St. Jerome's. I'm also director of the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to the second in this year's series of public lectures sponsored by St. Jerome's. The title of this year's lecture series is From Hate to Love, Are There Pathways to Peace? The question is an important one. Events at home and around the world remind us that religion can act as a motivation for acts of love and peace, but also hatred and violence. Christians, Jews, and all people of faith and goodwill are forced to ask themselves, how can we unite our yearning for peace and harmony in a world torn apart by conflict? While there are many signs that could lead us to despair, there are also signs of hope. Unprecedented acts of solidarity, peacemaking, and forgiveness. The excellent relations between the Jewish Studies program here at the University of Waterloo and St. Jerome's University, the Roman Catholic University in Waterloo, is one of those signs of hope. I'm teaching a course this semester on religious pluralism in Canada, and apart from the Aboriginal peoples, Jews represented the first act of religious diversity, first in New France, then in British North America, then the Dominion of Canada, and finally Canada as we know it today. The history has not always been a happy one, and Christians, Roman Catholics included, have much to atone for. From this position of that historical imagining, it is remarkable, nevertheless, that Jews and Roman Catholics can cooperate so effectively and amicably today to discuss issues of spirituality, holiness, and social responsibility, issues we have in common. Even if we realize that much is needed to be done, we should acknowledge that real progress has been made. Today, I want to go further than simply celebrating this progress. I wish to challenge my fellow Christians in the audience tonight. I want you to think about this. I want you to think that it is impossible to be a serious Christian without taking Judaism seriously. My own formation in the Christian faith has taken many unexpected turns. At the University of Toronto, I studied with Alan Davies, a United Church minister known for his studies of Christian anti-Semitism. I ended up doing my master's paper with him on Freud's theory of religion, looking at Freud as a Jewish author writing in an increasingly anti-Semitic Vienna. Later, both at the University of Toronto and at McGill University in Montreal, I studied with Gregory Baum, a former Roman Catholic priest who fled Nazi Germany as a child. Dr. Baum, a friend of Rabbi Marmur's, wrote many books on anti-Semitism and Jewish-Christian relations. As an advisor to Cardinal Bea at the Second Vatican Council, he wrote the first draft of Nostra Aetate, the foundational document for rethinking the Roman Catholic rejection of Judaism. Finally, at McGill, I studied the work of American Lutheran theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, with one of Canada's foremost Protestant thinkers, Douglas John Hall. Niebuhr had a profound respect for Judaism and felt that many, or rather most, Christians could learn from its prophetic tradition, and Dr. Hall shared this empathy. Looking over my academic career, I saw that the Christians I admired most took Judaism seriously. And so tonight I would argue that it is impossible to be a serious Christian without taking Judaism seriously. For historical, ethical, social, and theological reasons, to be a serious Christian is to wrestle with Judaism, to find wisdom, strength, and courage there on those occasions when we agree, and to learn acceptance, tolerance, and compassion from those times we differ. And so I'm very pleased that Rabbi Dov Marmur has agreed to deliver the 2003-2004 School Board's lecture here today. The school board's lecture is an annual lecture endowed by the Waterloo Catholic District School Board, the Grey Bruce Catholic District School Board, and the Brantford Norfolk Catholic District School Board. Let's face it, it's a pretty Catholic event. This year, the school board's lecture, though, is sponsored by the Jewish Studies program here at the University of Waterloo, as well as the Devlin Lecture Fund, an annual lecture fund here established at the St. Jerome Center in memory of John Devlin. I wish I had the privilege of introducing to you Rabbi Marmur, whom I have heard speak on several occasions. But that honor goes to the director of Jewish Studies of the Jewish Studies program here at UW, Dr. Jim Diamond. So without further ado, Dr. Diamond.
Thank you, David, but of course you had the great honor of introducing me, so... when I was asked to introduce our speaker tonight, I considered it an honor, but now I consider it even a greater honor after having spent the last couple of hours with Rabbi Marmur. Rabbi Marmur has had an illustrious career as a spiritual leader and an academic, as a rabbi and as a scholar, senior rabbi at major congregations in Britain and in Canada, lecturer and senior lecturer at Massey College, St. Michael's College, author of a number of books, at least 5 that I've read about, and numerous articles on various issues of theology, Zionism, Israel, Holocaust, and, of course, Jewish-Christian relations. And in some ways, echoing David's sentiments, without people like Rabbi Marmur, an event like tonight could never have happened. That is, an event being sponsored jointly by the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience and the Department of Jewish Studies, often in a kind of sorry past, now being more and more an ancient past. The Catholic experience was at odds, to say the least, with the Jewish experience. And of course, that's not the case anymore, and that's a tribute to people like Rabbi Dov Marmur. So I take great pleasure in introducing you to Rabbi Marmur, who will address the profound question of spirituality and holiness. Are they mutually exclusive?
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. You know what it means when a rabbi takes off his watch before he starts speaking? Nothing, absolutely. When I became a rabbi more than 4 decades ago, it was clear to me that the greatest challenge to organized religion I'd have to face in my work would be at best secular indifference and more likely secular hostility. So my task would be fourfold and seemingly contradictory. First, I'd have to circle the wagons in the face of danger in order to provide some sense of security to the faithful. Secondly, at the same time, I'd have to try and reach out to those who chose to be outside, perhaps by persuading them that they weren't as secular as they thought they were, or that my institution wasn't as religious as they feared it might be. Third, I'd also have to engage in constructive criticism of the prevailing secular mores, so attacking the people I was supposed to attract. And fourthly, for the sake of integrity, I wasn't to be afraid to criticize the institution I served. For this was a time when breast beating was a popular pastime in churches and synagogues alike. Of course, I never got it right. If I circled the wagons too much, I was in danger of becoming intolerant, exclusionary, narrow-minded, and otherworldly. Second, if I'd reach out too much, I was in danger of cheapening my religious commitment for the sake of popular acceptance, of being too much of this world and not enough of the next. 3, when I ventured to be critical of secularism, I stood accused of both exclusionary intolerance and cheapening the religious message for the sake of notoriety. And fourthly, if I were too vocally self-critical, I was obviously unsuited for my task. Things have changed in the 40 years. Today it seems that the greatest challenge to conventional religious institutions and theologies isn't secularism, but what I'd like to call the quest for spirituality. Whereas secularism attacked religion from without, yearning for spirituality attacks it or addresses it from within. The stress nowadays is much more on inwardness than on social responsibility, more on individual prayer than on collective action, more on personal involvement and discretion, and less on institutional authority and profile. In the years before my retirement, I was more likely to be accused of being too this worldly and not sensitive enough to the unique predicaments of the members of my congregation in their quest for personal, often otherworldly, religious experience. However, self-criticism to the point of public self-flagellation remained the order of the day. It showed sensitivity and a readiness to accommodate dissenters. In the words of a contemporary Jewish thinker, Irving Greenberg, is reported to have said, "It doesn't matter to which denomination you belong, as long as you're ashamed of it." It was acceptable to reject or at least question the orderly, sober quest for the sacred as manifest in traditional liturgy and in established religious practices. Critics from within would object at times vehemently to the hierarchical structure of the institutions I served, and in many ways epitomized, even though or because holiness, as understood through the ages, is often manifest in hierarchy. What was demanded of me now was informality and spontaneity that offered intimations of spirituality. The people I came across often wanted to express themselves emotionally and freely, without the constraints traditional services and customary sermons impose. What people were looking for wasn't erudition, but charisma, not competence, but enthusiasm. Doctrinal orthodoxy was giving way to what a colleague of mine has aptly described as spiritual promiscuity. In place of the old dichotomy between the sacred and the secular inside the church and synagogue and outside, I don't know enough about the mosque to be able to comment in it. In place of this old dichotomy, there's emerged a new dichotomy between the sacred and the spiritual. between external behavior and internal quest. As a result, conventional churches and synagogues alike are losing adherence to new structures and innovative manifestations of the life of the Spirit. Already in 1987, Reginald Bibby, Canada's own sociologist of religion, reported that organized religion in Canada has experienced a startling decline in service attendance. The fact that these seeming innovations have old antecedents in no way dampens the religious quest and the hope for renewal. For example, Hasidic Judaism may be at least 2 centuries old and go back to much older forms, all critical of the established order of the time, and the spiritual quest in Christianity may indeed have very old roots, but it's the way these have been perceived and presented in our time that has come to threaten existing religious institutions. The fact that the presentation often owes much to Oriental religions, which well-traveled young women and men have encountered in faraway lands, and which others have brought to our shores under one brand name or another. This has all added to the challenge of the threat to conventional Western religiosity. Yet the difference between the affirmation of secularity and the search for spirituality may not be as far apart as it seems. In 1965, 3 years after I was ordained, Harvey Cox published his stirring The Secular City. I well recall its impact on many of us and the resulting loss of nerve on the part of some. Rather than thinking vertically by turning our gaze to the divine, we were encouraged now to think horizontally and relate to each other as a way to reach out to God, or instead of reaching out to God. We read Martin Buber and similar thinkers who stressed the relationship between human beings and pointed to the implied quest for God that arose out of that. Now, the second part of Cox's book is called The Church in Secular City, and it opens with the assertion, and I quote, "The starting point of any theology of the church today must be a theology of social change." And then Cox goes on to describe the nature of that change. The book moved many of us to engage in social action, even if it meant abandoning conventional piety, of embracing the secular city at the expense of the sacred altar. We saw here a reformulation of the message of the Hebrew prophets, not least in their alleged criticism of the priests. Rather than offering a corrective to secularism, we try to incorporate it into our pastoral work and offered, I lived in London in those days, and offered soup kitchens in place of divine services. If you can't beat it, join it, became something of our motto. In my own reform movement in Judaism, social action was on the top of our agenda. Marching for civil rights took precedence over sitting in synagogue. For rabbis, being relevant became much more important than being authentic. Yet, in the preface to his Feast of Fools, published only 4 years later, Harvey Cox suggests that secularity may not be as far removed from what we now know as spirituality than it first seems. He explains, and I quote, "Some people rightly saw the book, The Secular City, as far too one-sided in its eager activism, its zealous concern for social change, its hyperthyroid extraversion. In this book, I turn somewhat to the other side. If The Secular City was Apollonian, this book is more Dionysian, more playful, more generous to religion than was The Secular City. Some may even say it is more soul. Without retreating from my affirmation of the secular, I touch here on a different range of issues, including meditation, mysticism, prayer, and ritual." So far Harvey Cox. Now the link between the critique from without and the critique from within had now been established. Outward social activism would have to be supplemented and later even replaced by the inward quest for the spiritual. It's this seeming transformation that is the principal theme of my address today. And I hope that by the time I've finished, the notion of bringing peace despite contradictions, despite enmity, can be established also in this realm. Now, consistent with this change of direction, in yet another book, Turning East, with the intriguing subtitle, The Promise and Peril of the New Orientalism, Harvey Cox reports on personal experiences in his endeavor to link the contemporary yearning for spirituality with his affirmation of secularity. For all his reservations about Eastern religions, he writes that, and I quote, "It seems that all our postmodern gurus hold in common a firm conviction that to encounter the holy today, one must move deeper into the godless world, not away from it. The yearning for spirituality, then, the quest for holiness, and the affirmation of the secular are seen now as part of the same syndrome." My own teacher in rabbinic school and thereafter, the late Ignaz Maybaum, who died in 1976, exposed me to a very different vision of religiosity. Much of it has remained with me to this day. His starting point was startling, perhaps even shocking. It centered on a verse in the book of Ezekiel, I quote, "When I passed by you and saw you wallowing in your blood, I said to you, B'damai chayi, live in spite of your blood. Yea, I said to you, live in spite of your blood." Now, the Hebrew words B'damai chayi could also be translated as live in your blood or live by your blood. Now, here is not the place to review that strange and enigmatic verse, the many possibilities of meaning, its context in the Babylonian exile of around 600 before Common Era, the place of that verse in the Jewish circumcision ritual today. All this I have to leave out. Instead, I want to concentrate on Maybaum's interpretation that may be relevant in the context of this lecture. But before I do so, I have to point out that Maybaum's term for the Holocaust is Churban, and the Holocaust is central to his thinking. The Hebrew word Churban translates as destruction. It's the term by which Jewish tradition knows the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 before Common Era, and as the second destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem by the Romans in the year 70 Common Era. Ezekiel prophesied after the first Churban. In Maybaum's terms, contemporary Jews are survivors of the third Churban, the Holocaust. Despite 2,500 years and more between Ezekiel's times and ours, there are similarities. Maybaum writes as follows, and I quote, "After the first Churban, the Jewish people was a people without a state and without a country, and therefore different from the Gentiles. Yet it was told by its prophet to live in history as the Gentiles do. The commandment, live in thy blood, means live as creatures of God, live as the Jewish people, do not live the spiritual life in which man, the Creator, cuts himself off from creation. Live as a people, but live as a people of God." It was different in the second Churban. After the dissolution of the Maccabean state, a part of the Jewish people, namely the first Christians, stopped living as a people and began to live as members of a church. Spirit, not blood, makes the Christian. Spirit, a turning away from the human situation, a leap of man, the creature, into a superhuman situation. Now, so much for Maybaum. Despite his at times oblique and often rhetorical language, Maybaum's message is clear. Authentic Judaism shuns so-called spirituality because by it, as Maybaum puts it, man cuts himself off from creation. What happened after the second destruction in 70 Common Era, when Christianity emerged and turned the attention of adherents from flesh to spirit, must not happen after this third destruction between 1933 and 1945. Not disembodied spirituality, but an affirmation of life for flesh and blood. Not the city of God, but the city of human beings where ordinary folk work and play. Or in traditional Jewish parlance, not the heavenly Jerusalem, but the earthly Jerusalem. Not a place of supernatural redemption, but the struggle for freedom in time and space. Much of Jewish history in the last half-century must be seen in this light. The insistence on a physical home for the Jewish people is its most obvious manifestation. To say it again then, spirituality in Maybaum's scheme of things is a Christian concept, not a Jewish one. Judaism, he insisted, doesn't distinguish between the flesh and the spirit, but between the holy and the profane. Life, according to Judaism, is psychosomatic, not divided between the physical and the spiritual. Everything can be made holy, including that which is particularly that which is still profane, which means everything. Contrary to Cox's notion of a godless world, Maybaum would say that as God can be everywhere, our task is to make the world as godly as possible by sanctifying it, by letting God in. Ethical conduct that transcends religious divides is one way in which all religious communities can turn the world from the profane to the holy, not to seek to escape it by way of the Spirit. Now, another critic of the current trend towards spirituality is a man called, people haven't heard of him in general, Michael Cherniak, a professor at the Hebrew Union College that trains Reform rabbis in North America. Cherniak affirms the broad definition of normative Judaism as, I quote, living one's life knowing that one is in the presence of God, end of quote. But he rejects that which today often goes under the name of spirituality. First, the attempt to be at one with God, the union mystica, and second, what he calls warm, fuzzy spirituality. He rejects the union mystica because it seeks to annihilate the human dimension as we know it. Therefore, in his words, it's a form of suicide. He attacks the warm, fuzzy spirituality because the contemporary synagogue, he doesn't speak of the church, under the influence of New Age religion, is plagued by it. He is particularly troubled by the absence of the sense of awe that holiness seeks to instill. He writes, and I quote again, I have purposely chosen a derogatory name for this variety of spirituality because I regard it as Jewishly fraudulent and inane. It is the feeling of being loved and cared by God who always is good and kind and sweet-natured. This God always seems to be present in caring communities where there's lots of singing, hugging, crying, and openness. Cherniak sees this kind of spirituality as a function of psychology, not theology. He writes that those who yearn for the spiritual paradoxically seek community, not God, and that the sadness of fin de siècle loneliness and neediness is vividly clear when any somewhat decent experience of community can be viewed as an epiphany. Further, he states that this spirituality is rather narcissistic. It depends on the pleasure it gives the ever-present and ever-demanding me. In this scheme of things, then, God is reduced to a source of personal pleasure, and as soon as the going gets rough, the devotee abandons the service of God, since it only existed to serve the self. In these terms, it may not be very far from secular existence, where consumer choice dominates not only the market but life itself. I myself have come across many spiritual individuals who tell me that last year they were into Hasidism, this year they're trying Tai Chi. Though every contemporary exponent of Judaism, as of Christianity, is sensitive to the yearning for comfort, such comfort can be, as Maybaum would also say, spurious and unsatisfactory. It's a reflection of contemporary culture, which Christopher Lasch has described as the culture of narcissism, and which Cox and others have identified as secular/spiritual, seeking the ostensibly divine in the purely human, but giving it a religious patina. Ezekiel's genius consisted in showing the survivors of the first Khurban how structure, often manifest in ritual, could help communities, and only through communities, individuals, to rebuild their lives in a tangible blood, not in ephemeral spirit. But in the meantime, the rules of engagement seem to have changed. Nowadays, alas, we can only think of blood in its most negative and dangerous connotations. Though Cherniak teaches in a school for Reform rabbis, he is in fact an Orthodox rabbi himself. His colleague in the same institution describes himself as classical Reform, as it were the other end of the spectrum. Yet, this other man, Philip Miller, has a criticism that's of the same ilk, for the reservations about spirituality are, I believe, as strong in the Orthodox community, despite the veneer of orthodoxy that Hasidic Jews display, as they are among liberal Jews, despite the pseudo-Oriental religious experimentation, the spiritual promiscuity in its circles. Writing in the same collection in which Chernik's essays appear, and presumably addressing himself to the same rabbinic students, Miller asserts that too many of our leaders, both religious and lay, have brought into the view that prayer is a celebration of community. With much sarcasm, he says that we stand around and sing our own praises, albeit in the name of God. How wonderful we are that we have gathered to praise God. Miller laments the state of affairs when he writes, "We have in our worship stopped celebrating the centrality of the holy in favor of celebrating ourselves. Plainly out, too many of our religious leaders have confounded the narcissistic celebration of community with a quest for holiness." Reginald Beebe seems to be in the same mind when he writes that, ironically, in trying to get in step with the modern age, organized religion by dismantling the gods and serving them up piecemeal is running the risk of becoming increasingly trivial. Miller's words remind me of those early days in my rabbinic career when my aim was to appease secular critics. The dynamic seems to be the same, even though, as I suggested earlier, the direction seems to have shifted from the external to the internal, from alleged secularity to alleged spirituality. So, as quoted earlier, Cox suggests that to encounter the holy today, one must move deeper into the godless world, not away from it. The contemporary Jewish thinkers I've cited so far imply the quest for the holy, that the quest of the holy is very different. They see the sacred as a way of bridging the gap between God and humanity by way of imitatio Dei, through collective human action. They respond to the biblical injunction that commands, "You," plural in the Hebrew original, "you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." They believe that spirituality, by contrast, is the individual's quest to merge with the divine. Instead of collective imitation of God, as normative Judaism understands it, so the argument goes, we now have the quest for individual unio mystica. Not that this quest is alien to the history of Judaism, but it suggested it has never been normative and almost always a threat to the traditional structure of Jewish life and practice. Now, I've so far tried very hard to avoid definitions, both of holiness. I use the term holy and sacred interchangeably, although some scholars do make distinctions between them. So I've used the term holy, sacred, and spirituality. My hope has been that by juxtaposing holiness and spirituality, I'd be able to say something about each without getting bogged down in definitions. For I've accepted the description offered by John Rogerson, a British scholar, that, I quote, "Holiness is a word in the English language whose meaning depends upon the context in which it is used and the interests of those who use it." Therefore, instead of offering abstract definitions of the term, I've tried to present a context in which it's being used. I've contrasted it to the term spirituality that seeks to stress the non-physical over the physical aspect of human existence, and suggested that normative Judaism is against it, even though contemporary Judaism encounters it every day and every hour. The authority to be cited in the description of holiness is, of course, Rudolf Otto and his famous book, The Idea of the Holy. But though it was very popular when it first appeared in the 1920s, and for many decades thereafter, nowadays volumes are being written to tell readers where Otto went wrong. To me, Otto is important because he takes up the idea of Friedrich Schleiermacher, the German theologian, who some 2 centuries ago established that religion is an autonomous sphere within human experience that is irreducible and which can only be understood according to its own distinctive features. Holiness, in Otto's understanding, is sui generis and shouldn't be reduced to something else. It can be juxtaposed to alternatives, but not reduced to them. Now, part of the malaise of modernity is religious reductionism. It assumes that religion can only be explained in terms of something else, notably psychology. Think of Freud's onslaught. Such reductionism robs religionists of self-confidence and self-esteem. The affirmation of holiness as sui generis seeks to restore both. Which brings me to Charles Liebman, whose death has just been reported. He was arguably the foremost sociologist of the Jewish religion. He was among those who, despite his own dispassionate academic interest, passionately championed the primacy of the holy and as a result was critical of the clamor for the spiritual. He began his reflection with a telling comment about religious marketing in America. I quote, "Compared to churches and synagogues in Europe and Israel, religious congregations in the United States are far more responsive to the religious market. They tend to accept and accommodate prevailing cultural norms rather than rejecting and seeking to restructure these norms. They take it for granted that their function is to provide a service of some kind to their members and to attract as many new members as they can by satisfying them more than does some neighboring institution. Many of the mega churches today are the products of successful religious marketing." Reginald Bibby is of the same opinion in his important book, Fragmented Gods, when he asserts, and I quote again, "Religion, instead of standing over against culture, has become a neatly packaged consumer item, taking its place among other commodities that can be bought or bypassed according to one's consumption whims. Religion has become little more than a cultural product and is coming precariously close to acknowledging that culture creates the gods." So much for Bibi. In market-driven religion, traditional norms are often seen not only as obsolete, but also as inferior when compared to the sincerity and spirituality of contemporaries. I'm quoting Liebman again in an attempt to explain why the issue concerns me as a Jew and as a rabbi, and why it confuses me. On the one hand, I can see the positive dimension of the new quest. Who couldn't? But on the other, I'm committed to the distinctive and unique nature of Judaism, founded on a collective awareness of the sacred, which, as the Hebrew word for it, kadosh, suggests, also means set apart and distinct. The current stress on the individual spirituality may jeopardize the nature of the collective and the corporate. And here's another quote from Liebman. "Developments in the last 2 decades are characterized by the emergence of personal and privatized Judaism at the expense of ethnic Judaism. Ethnic Judaism has given way to a form of privatized religion. This religion speaks in softer terms of individual meaning, journeys of discovery, spirituality, and the search for fulfillment. Its emphases are interpersonal rather than collective. It values authenticity and sincerity over achievement or efficiency. Typically, it's non-judgmental, consoling, intuitive, and non-obligating." The Jews' self-understanding of their faith as distinct goes back to God's commandment. Quote a verse in Exodus, "Indeed, all the earth is mine, but you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." This leads Liebman to observe that we are commanded to be a holy, not a spiritual people. He reminds us that holiness is achieved in a congregation of worshippers as part of a public service. Spirituality points to individuality, transcendence, otherworldliness, while holiness points to the virtuous life. Holiness evokes an outside source to which we submit. Spirituality entails a process of self-realization. Now, whereas in the past I saw it as my task to fight secularism, and in later years to resist the clamor for spirituality, whether or not it was motivated by secularism, my aim nowadays is to seek ways of combining the tradition with its challenges. It's to this task that I now wish to turn. Though my emphasis continues to be the tradition I know best, namely Judaism, I hope that what I have to say is equally relevant to exponents of other religions. Though I remain skeptical, even hostile to the notion of spirituality as a substitute for religion, we've all heard people tell us, "I'm not religious, I'm spiritual." I've learned to appreciate the desire on the part of sincere worshippers, now no less than in ages past, when what we know as Jewish mysticism dominated. I respect the desire to deepen one's religious experience beyond the conventional framework. The liturgical changes I oversaw in the congregation I served for 17 years before my retirement, as well as the new activities we introduced, were part of this process. In other words, despite the critical views that about spirituality that I've cited so far, the life of the Spirit is, of course, central to Judaism. Though spirituality instead of holiness, as described here, constitutes a danger, spirituality as an expression of holiness is of the essence. Now, the man who has tried to combine the two is a contemporary Jewish scholar, Arthur Green. And I'm going to read a passage that he has written. "Seeking the face of God, striving to live in his presence, and to fashion the life of holiness appropriate to God's presence, these have ever been the core of that religious civilization known to the world as Judaism, the collective religious expression of the people of Israel. Such a statement of supreme value, aside from questions of how precisely it's to be defined and how it is achieved, such a statement could win the assent of biblical priest and prophet, of Pharisee and Essene sectarian, of Hellenistic contemplative and law-centered rabbi, of philosopher, Kabbalist, Chassid, and even of moderns who seek to walk in their footsteps." Green reminds us that the current Hebrew term for spirituality is a latecomer in the language, and the concept of disembodied spirituality is totally unknown. As Green puts it, spirituality in the Western sense, inevitably opposed to some degree of corporality or worldliness, is unknown to the religious worldview of ancient Israel. The common denominator of all manifestations of Judaism is Torah, God's word as found in Scripture and interpreted through the ages. In whatever form and whatever way it has been transmitted to the community, it's always the same Torah. There are no two Torahs. There's no holy or spiritual or this one. Rather than had I only been speaking about Jewish spirituality today rather than the more complex task I've set myself, all I would do is to speak about the dynamics of Jewish study as a way of reaching out to God by understanding God's will and trying to the best of one's ability to do that will. To assimilate as much as possible of what has been taught over the millennia and perhaps add something fresh is the supreme and never-ending task of every believing Jew. Through this activity, the sacred can be perceived and the life of the Spirit can be lived. And so the dichotomy needn't exist. However, authentic Jewish spirituality must be of one piece of the totality of Jewish life. In other words, Ezekiel's notion as understood by Mabam of living in your blood remains part of that, yes, spiritual quest. So how do we bridge the gap? On the one hand, we have to understand the need, why the gap needs to be bridged. Firstly, because there is a desire on the part of many for greater closeness to God and to fellow worshippers, something that accepted liturgical forms, dare I say, in any religious tradition can provide. Few regular worshippers can stay in their pews without creative maladjustment, often expressed in dissatisfaction with the sermon, have you noticed? And so the tendency to turn to other traditions for new inspiration and additional resources. Jews at the moment are in the process of the so-called high holidays, where you sit in synagogue for hours on end. How do you deal with that? And how do you make something of it? It's a great challenge. But we believe that it's a possibility. The second reason why we have to take this seriously and try to bridge the gap is because of the collapse of civil religion. The kind of Judaism and probably also Christianity that shaped the older generation, particularly the inhabitants of the secular city, allowed collective identification without demanding personal affirmation. Let me elaborate on both these things. First, rituals and prayers are built on collective memory we call tradition. One of the side effects of modernity is the loss of memory. Daniel Arvieux-Léger, the French sociologist of religion, has written that moderns suffer from a kind of collective memory loss, amnesia, because they are less and less capable of maintaining the memory that lies at the heart of their religious existence. Every Jew feels that though the liturgy, the tradition may be pregnant with meaning, those who are saying these words do not necessarily have the memory and the equipment to make it their own. Now, her British colleague, Grace Davy, quoting the words I've just cited, speaks of the paradox of modernity, which in its historical forms removes the need for and the sense of religion, the amnesia, but in its utopian forms must stay in touch with the religious, the need for the religious future. The amnesia makes people give up their religion. The utopia about an ideal religious state makes them at the same time pick and choose among faith traditions, experiment and try new forms, because the basic religious quest is still there, even though the past no longer seems to provide it. Those of us who still remember the past must therefore reach out to those who don't and affirm them in their search, not to condemn them. Second, even many in my generation said something like that. The religion that was good enough for my parents is good enough for me, even if I myself don't believe in God. Contemporaries are more likely to say, the religion, if any, I wish to transmit to my children must be good enough for me, because though I yearn for God, I don't find God in the religion of my parents. To paraphrase that famous saying, we moderns say, religion is hereditary, you inherit it from your children. Charles Longman puts it that religion has become privatized. Neither tradition nor community matter much, other than perhaps for the so-called life cycle events, birth, marriage, funeral. The stress between these is on me and mine. So I am looking for the kind of religiosity that will meet my needs and that I can transmit to my children, whether or not this religiosity is authentic or consistent is of little importance to me. What matters is that it be spiritual. Reginald Bibby speaks of religion à la carte. You have a menu and you pick and choose that which you think will meet your needs. You may say that my acceptance of spirituality is more pastoral than theological, because I've tried to understand this and affirm it. For me, tolerating the quest for utopian spirituality that is devoid of memory and responsibility, tradition and community, doesn't mean accepting these things, but I'm trying, living in the world in which I live, to face these realities. As far as I am concerned, Longman's distinction between collective holiness and individual spirituality stands. But I am also impressed by what Arthur Green has to say, and I quoted him, and here's another quote. Judaism's commitment to the reality of this world, rooted in the demands of Israel's ancient prophets, does not allow for spirituality of entire otherworldly character. The only true test of one's love of God is one's ability to share in the love of God's creatures. Only in the human community are the virtues learned in spiritual training made real. The careful balancing of worldliness, including the commitment to Jewish legal responsibility and inwardness, is perhaps the most clear distinguishing mark of Jewish spirituality. Now, I understand Green to say that I cannot transmit spirituality to my children unless what I have to teach them is rooted in tradition. In other words, to make that spirituality living and authentic, I cannot just think of the future, my children. I have to have the memory of the past, of that which I have inherited. And if I can do that, I don't have to have the dichotomy. I don't have to make the one the enemy of the other. one of the Hasidic masters, or the Hasidic master, the founder of Hasidism, Israel Baal Shem Tov, who died in around 1760, commented on the prayer, one of the central prayers in Judaism that begins with the words, "Our God and God of our ancestors." And he asked, why do we need both? And he said, you need the God of the ancestors in order to provide you with a framework and a route, and I paraphrase. But you must have my God in order to have the personal experience. And what I've come to realize that in my tradition, despite all the differences and the dichotomies that I bored you with in the first half of the lecture, I believe that that kind of coming together is possible, with all the implications for other religions, for a mutual understanding, for an internal cohesiveness, and yes, for solidarity. Though I speak out of my experience and practice of Judaism, I'd like to think that the same could be said about other faiths too. That's how I understand Ken Wilber's new paradigm. It's neither dismissive of spirituality nor uncritical of it. Though I rarely see him quoted in august academic circles, what he has to say seems relevant to the stance I've taken this evening. He writes, I do not think that all or even most of those states that claim to be transpersonal or spiritual are actually that. The human capacity for self-delusion is too enormous to take all such claims at face value. A highly critical, occasionally skeptical, and sometimes even polemical attitude must be our constant companion on the road to any sort of truth. The commodity most lacking in spiritual circles seems to be indeed a healthy skepticism. And basing himself on teachings of medieval mystics, Wilber tells us to see things with three eyes. The eyes of flesh, by which we perceive the external world of space, time, and objects. Second, the eye of reason, by which we attain a knowledge of philosophy, logic, and the mind itself. And thirdly, the eye of contemplation, by which we rise to a knowledge of transcendental realities. To perceive reality and elevate it through sanctification, we need all three eyes. If conventional religion, supported by science and philosophy, enables us to see with two eyes, spirituality deploys the third. To put one against the other creates a false dichotomy that distorts the truth. Speaking of Ignaz Maybaum's interpretation of Ezekiel's reference to blood, I've tried to view religion with the eye of flesh. In my effort to be critical of the clamor for spirituality, I've tried to see things with the eye of reason. By affirming the possibility of a fusion between the current stress on spirituality and the perennial commitment to tradition, I've tried to acknowledge the vision that only the eye of contemplation can behold. It's a vision, incidentally, that cuts across earlier religious divides and has potential for real dialogue. That has been my feeble contribution to it. Thank you very much.
Rabbi Marmur has graciously accepted to answer some questions. Usually we have a microphone that goes around the audience.
About a year ago, we had a speaker from Harvard University who I believe made the point that Judaism is a religion of act rather than belief. How does that relate to what he said tonight?
Well, I can't speak for the professor of Haifa University who said that Judaism is a religion of action rather than belief. It's an old rabbinic dichotomy. What comes before, the teaching or the deed? The answer is the teaching, because it leads to the deed. Now you tell me whether it's the one or the other. Thank you. Yes, sir. I will try. See. How do we promote spiritual, does one promote spiritual education? I have often tried to persuade the congregations that I've served that religion, whatever form, is a virus, and you should catch it. And parents are good sources of it, yes? That's the obvious traditional Jewish view. Teachers in the scheme of things can teach you about religion, but not religion. Having said that, I can think in my own life of many exceptions. I grew up in Sweden. Throughout my school years, I was the only Jew in the school. How did I come to being a rabbi? Because of a role model, a teacher, who was a Lutheran theologian. Wasn't the content again, but it was the manner, the approach, the way of doing things. And it was in fact he who encouraged me by saying, in last year at school, I want you to do a paper on Judaism. I didn't know much about it, but I wanted to please him. And that's how it started. It was so teachers can be models, and we know that that's very true in Judaism. In fact, this is not the time, but much is being told by the Talmud, in the Talmud, in the rabbinic sources, about serving your teacher. The story, I don't know whether I should tell it, but one day one of the great rabbis heard a strange noise under his bed. He was in bed with his wife. And it turns out to be one of his disciples. Shocked. He said, what are you doing here? He said, Rabbi, I have to learn everything. Makes the point. Whether it's a true story or not is irrelevant. In other words, particularly in our time, because of the memory loss, because of the amnesia, teachers become in loco parentis in this sense. They are the carriers of the memory, and they have to find a way of making that memory alive by at the same time allowing their students to dream beyond that which they offer. It's a great challenge in religious education. Few of us succeed often. Mercifully, some of us succeed some of the time. I didn't get that. Would you repeat? Well, you know, I started off by saying that I had 4 different objectives when I started. In a sense, a bit of contradictory things are necessary. And one of them is great openness to other things. You know, I have, over the years, come across a number of parents who brought up their children in a liberal atmosphere, but their children decided to change the religious course, often becoming more orthodox or whatever. And they've come to me that I should rescue their children from the course. Instead, I've tried to open their minds to other possibilities than those they've provided. And that's the challenge of the teacher. But we all have our limitations. We're all human. We all carry our own baggage, so we don't necessarily succeed. And so there is this tension between the ideal and what reality has to offer. And I don't wish to conceal from you that religious education is a great problem in the Jewish community, as it is everywhere else. That we can be quite successful in teaching about Judaism. It's another matter of trying to instruct in, as it were, or spread the virus or whatever. But it's done, and it's possible. However, we don't know. And what happens if we create a vacuum, if we don't do that, is that you have the polarization, the extremism. On the one hand, a mindless fanaticism, on the other, a mindless hostility. And how to bridge that gap is the challenges which involve us. Yes, sir.
It has struck me, and I'm going to ask you to comment on this, that as religions have become more friendly in the latter part of the 20th century, as they able to relate to each other more, one has noticed that there isn't the differences in morality that bigots used to claim there were between the various religions. And so it struck me that many people may find not much difference from one religion to the other, except for the ritualistic demands of the religions. For example, Roman Catholicism may require a Mass, Judaism requires certain types of prayer. Is the search for spirituality amongst these people a way of getting some kind of a reward for the ritualistic side of the religion, given that the morality or ethics seem to be relatively the same across the board? And if so, how do you try to provide that reward to individuals?
I haven't spoken about morality and ethics because I think if secularism has taught us anything, it is that no religion or has a franchise on it, and that you don't have to be religious to act morally, whatever the origins may be. But I think that the coming, the closeness of religions in no way blurs the differences between them. My experience suggests that people engaged in interfaith dialogue are strengthened in their own faith, paradoxically, not moving into some kind of syncretism. The key again is the memory versus the dreaming of the future. I believe there is infinitely more in Roman Catholicism or in Judaism or in Lutheran Protestants or whatever than the ritual. The ritual may be the outer manifestation, fermented wine, unfermented wine, what do I know? But behind it is a history and a memory that makes for a totality that is infinitely greater than the top of that iceberg, which may be the ritual. I think it was Gershom Scholem, one of the great giants of Jewish scholarship, who spoke of rituals as the tip of the iceberg and said that if you uncover it a little, you encounter enormous depth. And these are unique to various traditions. And so I would not accept the premise that it's only a few rituals and it doesn't matter. I think that there's great depth, and my feeling is that those who cooperate and understand each other become, to repeat, more affirmed in their own religion. They're stimulated by it. My Protestant school teacher in Sweden turned me into a rabbi, yes, not into a Protestant clergyman. Sorry.
I agree with you absolutely on everything you said. How do you deal with the members of a faith who in that faith see only the ritual as dividing it from somebody else, and the ritual not providing them with a spiritualistic reward?
Well, that's when I talk about that breaking the barriers and the dichotomy, in which you can show how that's done. The Jewish bridge is called Torah study, which may have a legalistic, ritualistic dimension, but it has an infinitely larger dimension of instruction, the totality of life. And to the extent that, speaking from my own tradition, that I can do that and not leave it to some behaviorist action, I am able to succeed. Some people, many people, don't want to know because for all kinds of forces, and there I have found that you still have to say what you have to say, even if your students don't listen to you, because you never know what they'll remember and act on 20 years later. You know it from your own experience. Madam. Eyes.
So I was really intrigued by those comments, and coming from a Eastern background. So I was wondering if you incorporate that in your preaching, or is it part of your religion, or is it a new trend that you
No, I don't think so. I think that to stress one's physicality, yes, one's ethnic commitment, to stress one's rationality, which is the second I, and at the same time to encourage and integrate it in the context of contemplation is something that is as old as Judaism. I'm not doing I'd love to be an innovator and a rebel, but I'm just a poor conformist. Yes, sir.
What do you mean by the eye of contemplation?
By the eye of contemplation, I mean that which neither the physical nor the mental can touch. It's not instead of either, yes? I began by talking about spirituality versus the physical, yes? That's something that I can't cope with. Similarly, my perception, my world of religion, tries not to go against reason, but recognizes that there is beyond reason. And the world of contemplation seeks to touch that part of reality that the others don't. And that's what I mean by that, and how we live in that kind of tension. Why I find it important to be physically present with my congregation now when I am a congregant like everybody else. Why I find it important to scrutinize what I read and what I say in terms of the rational world, and why at the same time I recognize why these are not sufficient and I'm looking for something beyond. Much of it my congregation provides in terms of music, in terms of all kinds of things. And that's what I mean. You don't need to have an arid service if you stay with liturgy for a moment. But at the same time, it doesn't have to be wild either. That there is that kind of tension, I don't go in for endless humming and hand clapping, which you find in some traditions. But at the same time, so that's what I mean by that general word of contemplation, which I took from Ken Wilber. We might find another term for the same thing. Yes, sir.
When I think of going into the holy, I often think of having to wrestle with suffering and with evil, and where is God in the midst of suffering and evil? And I think here you move in that direction, but it seems to me that's where spirituality doesn't often help me, but the holy God.
Well, there is in that. I could have given all kinds of lectures, and it's again a Jewish experience of suffering and evil. One of those who's written about the Holocaust and all that goes with it, world-renowned, is Elie Wiesel. He is quoted to have said that the Jew can be with God or against God, but never without God. That the spirituality or the holiness is part of the questioning, starting with Abraham, arguing with God about Sodom and Gomorrah, and continuing throughout. Or Job, the example. But that is an affirmation of God, even if it's a challenge to God. And spirituality is born out of these. I, in my early days in the liberal world in which I mixed, Judaism was idyllic, religion was idyllic, it was just lovely. The world that I came from, which was the world of Holocaust survivors, it was the opposite. I have learned over the years that the two are part of reality. And when you say, and to come back to that quotation which I could have from Ezekiel, live in your blood, it's part of that process. Yes? Work at it. Sweat. I don't come from it either. It doesn't come naturally to me. But there are all kinds of things. I'm sure you work at all kinds of things that you don't have, but you think are worthwhile. And I don't think that the religious tradition framework is different. I was given a book tonight by your president. I've been a reader, I haven't read this book, but I've been a reader of Thomas Merton. It's about spiritual geography of Thomas Merton for a long time, who was, in one sense, the free spirit par excellence, but at the same time forced himself not only to the ritual, but also to a discipline and an obedience way, which was why? Because he felt that enriched his spirituality. That the memory, if you want, or all that goes with it, deepens you. And so nowadays, of course, for all kinds of reasons, that's another lecture about the way we want the world to go, in sound bites and whatever else. Anything that isn't immediate, we tend to discard and leave. That there is a great joy, irrespective of whatever religious tradition you come from or want to enter, of imposing oneself the discipline of it. Now, not either or. I have preached for many years what I call incremental Judaism. When there was a few years ago, one of the banks said one customer at a time. Yes? I say one mitzvah, one good deed at a time, one act at a time, yes? And then you come back for more. And the more you have it, the easier it is. I wish I could apply my teaching to weight watching. So I know how difficult it is. Yes, sir.
Rabbi, would you encourage the members of your congregation to pray the Psalms alone or to reflect on the Scriptures privately?
Well, that's for sure. That's for sure. There's a Yiddish saying, don't rely on miracles, recite the Psalms, yes? And you do that, and there's a tradition of doing that all the time. I wouldn't discourage anybody from doing such things, but I would suggest that there is something in the collective experience which goes beyond it. Theoretically, this institution could have sent you a tape tonight. But yet you've come out, for which I'm most grateful, because the experience of being here is part of the message. And dare I say, sometimes, hope not tonight, of course, sometimes you go back and say, yeah, it was good, whatever, what did he say? I have no idea. The experience is nevertheless something that's important. I think are we ready to, or shall we take one more question? One quote question, if there is one. If not, I must tell you, 3 years ago this time, I was in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, with a self-finish, talking about impressions you make on people by speaking. I preached in the congregation. Afterwards, one of the elders of the congregation came up and said, I'm a founder of this congregation. I've been a member of 50 years. And I want you to know that at no time in this congregation has a finer sermon been preached than yours. I said, that's very nice, thank you very much. He said, but I'd like a copy of it. I said, why? Well, you see, I'm very deaf, didn't hear much.